have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Osborne, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hamay, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live, broadcasting right from the City of Angels. This is truly an international show right here where it is 7 p.m. Pacific time. Still rather warm, unlike the East Coast where you guys are at 10 p.m. Eastern time where you are rather cold. And same thing in England, where my lovely co-host is, my good friend, of course, and infamous co-host, Johnny Webb, coming to you live, 3 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, from London, England, in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom. How cool of that is to say. Now, real quick, before we talk about our guest, which I'm sure you've seen on social media, then you know exactly what you're about to get into tonight. Let me just go through two small things for you today. As everybody who's paid attention to the paranormal, extraterrestrials, their vehicles in particular, has probably known that obviously they have to operate on or use some sort of gravity waves to, if you want to exceed the speed of light or possibly create a wormhole or just have a distortion in the space-time fabric. Well, now by observing what happened 1.3 billion years ago, there was two black holes, binary black holes, that means two. They collided and created one, and what they saw was a ripple effect, of course, of gravity waves. So finally we have mainstream media saying that they have the discovery that only happens once or twice in a century, confirming something that everybody here listening, has known, or at least has been talking about for several decades. The other thing, this being a crazy year, not only is it going to be on this month, it should be a leap year. This, in a couple weeks, it'll be the 29th. So, if those of who are born on February 29th, this will be either your, one of four birthdays, or should I say, whatever you want to call it. If you're 12, then this would technically put you at 3. And you also have the Olympic year, but most importantly, those living in the United States, you have the presidential election, which is by far the absolute craziest one I have ever seen in my life. With that being said, though, now I'll let you guys, throw some topics up there or throw some what you want to say, anything you want to say about Trump or Hillary or Sanders. I just think it's all funny, and at the same time, I think we're progressing to an anti-establishment center. That's sort of a lot of what the big candidates are shooting for. Now, Senator Gravel, who comes on this show very, very often, is going to be on soon. When I talked to him recently, last week actually, when I asked him, we tried to book a date, he was not feeling that well, he was under the weather, and I said, is there anything you would like me to tell the listeners? He said yes. I said, give him this message. I said, what is it? He said, tell them I, Senator Mike Gravel, predict Bernie Sanders will be the winner. Yeah, well, we'll see if that's true. But that is his message. Now let's get on to an extremely important topic tonight. Hypnosis. Now, being from, background in Greece, hypno means sleep. Hypnosis is obviously, I'm actually going to let our guest talk about what that is because he can describe it to you so much more. Author of 21 books, 21 best-selling books, of course, including Past Lives, future books. There's Egypt, the Extraterrestrial, and Time Travel Experiment, and just so many other ones. And I'm just going to go ahead and bring them on. Dr. Bruce Goldberg, DDS. Dr. Goldberg, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Dr. J. It's a pleasure to incarnate on your show. And I want to make a comment earlier. You mentioned about time travel with the black holes and things like that. There was something that was done. This will titillate your Star Trek fans. And this is based on real hard science. Now, I do have my doctorates in dentistry, and I have a master's in counseling psychology, but I'm also a scientist with an undergraduate training in biochemistry, so I do take science rather seriously. In 1974, a Mexican physicist by the name of Miguel Alcubierre developed something called AWD, which stands for Alcubierre Warp Drive. This is like the warp drive you see on Star Trek.
Yes.
There's a real mathematical model where you can exceed the speed of light without generating the mass that everybody worries about, and a craft can go beyond the speed of light, which could take you to far ends of the universe, versus the worrying about the time and distance aspects. Of course, the other way is you can develop by going through wormholes. And when we discuss time travel, smart future, which is what the main topic is for tonight, or what I call chrononauts, you'll see
Yes.
how they develop that, not only to travel across time, space if they want to go to other planets, but also to travel back or forward in time by using the wormhole technology and theoretical mentality here. So we're going to discuss that too. It's a lot of fun.
I
By the way,
think they're...
I want to make one statement for your audience too, because I'm new to your show. As we talk about the key, the kind of bottom line to what we're talking about as we talk about time travel and all the other things is actually the fifth dimension. And so when I do shows, people say, this is great, you're talking about it, but I'd like to experience it. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to make an offer for your audience based on your show, and that is that if any of your audience wants to get any of my books, any of them, the Time Travel Smart Future, the Egypt book, or the Exploring the Fifth Dimension, my newest book, and we'll go into that. If they order it directly from my site, which is Dr. DR and then BruceGoldberg.com, they get a free CD which is titled Fifth Dimensional Travel. It's an out-of-body experience training which will take them into the fifth dimension. They can go into the past, the future. They can meet time travelers. They can go into parallel universes. They can do any of the things and even prepare themselves for teleportation, any of the things that we're going to discuss tonight. But they must mention the show. The offer is only good for your audience. So if they order it, simply say, as per your order on Dr. J Show, please send me the free CD, and they will get that automatically, with an autographed copy of the book, of course.
I'm actually glad you brought up the term chrononaut, because that is the most proper term. First of all, you have astronaut, people who travel to the stars, and when during the Soviet Union they decided to go anti-astro and use cosmonaut. So I think rather than using the term time traveler, which is in the most basic terms, you have chrononaut, which would be it is literally the same thing. It translates to the same thing, but chrononaut just sounds more professional.
You bring up your Greek background is showing here.
Yeah.
The chrono means time, of course. And
Yes.
by the way, for those people that other people have used the term chrononaut, trust me, I'm the one who developed it. My first book on time travel, called Time Travel Smart Future, was published in 1998, but I discussed time travelers and the chrononauts a couple of years before that. So I've got a 20-year history. So when people use the word chrononaut, you can't copyright a term, okay, but it is my development here. By the way, just to make a comment, you mentioned about the term hypnosis, just to make it very simple, because that is the modality that I use in reference to all the techniques we're going to discuss tonight. Hypnosis comes from the Greek word sleep, hypnos. When it was first discovered in a more scientific, shall we say, use, it used to be used as a carnival act, and back in the old days, the Middle Ages, etc. But there was a man named James Braid. He was, speaking of England, he was a British physician back in the early 1820s, and he used hypnosis on a medical surgical aspect and made it very scientific. He was the first real scientific use of hypnosis. We don't consider Mesmer to be a scientist, okay?
Yes.
And so he said, "This is." They said, "Well, what are you going to call this?" The press in those days was all newspaper reports, right? He said, "Well, we're going to call it hypnosis because it's sleep." Well, several years after working with the field, he realized that hypnosis is not a sleep state. It's a waking consciousness, just like a daydream. So then he said he wanted to change the name. Now, can you imagine a bunch of newspaper reporters sitting around with their little British outfits on, and their tea, no offense, John. And he says, well, I want to change the name of hypnosis. It's not a sleep state. So they said, what do you want to call it? So he said, monoideism. That's why we call it hypnosis today, okay? It didn't take very well, even though it's more...
Monoideism, you said?
Yeah,
so
it's
single...
one idea, because it's focused concentration. So
That's
he was
right.
to get scientific with it. The problem is, that's like speaking Victorian English to a rock concert, okay? It didn't work real well. And so anyway, hypnosis is misnamed, but people know what it means. They have a rough idea.
And
when you're...
I was going to say, I'm actually really glad you brought that point up, because it's not being asleep. Sleep is actually a lower state. There are several levels. There's delta, theta, beta, alpha even, right?
Well, what you're referring to is the sleep cycle. So let me just make it simple, because this is good. This is a very interesting. I work with people, patients from all over the world. I do Skype sessions. If they go to my homepage and my site, you can see how they can go. I can do sessions for people from all over the world. You don't have to come to Los Angeles. It's a beautiful city. but you can do things by Skype or computer, which is what I do. So when I do this, though, the point here is that there's a lot of misnomers to the field. So let's deal with the sleep cycle. So what people like to do a lot is go out of the body. Now this is a statement I'm going to make, and I'm going to support that. Every night of your life, you go through a sleep cycle. It's a 5-stage sleep cycle, and there are 4 brain waves. The waking brainwave that you're in now is called the beta wave. That's the conscious mind proper defense mechanism, short attention span, analytical, very cynical. That's what the beta level is. But when you go to sleep at night, you go into an alpha level, which is what they call hypnagogic, when you're just about to fall asleep, which is actually a daydream. So you're actually awake during that. Then you go through a theta wave, which is like deep meditation. Then you go through a delta wave, which is like you're almost dead to the count, it's almost flatlining. And then you go back into the alpha level again for stage 5. Now, when you're dreaming, the REM cycle, which is really a hypnotic level, when you're doing a dream cycle at night, and you do about 4 or 5 of these sleep cycles throughout the night, because they run about an hour and a half apiece, guess what? Not only are you in a REM cycle where your eyes are moving back and forth and you're dreaming, but you're actually into the 5th dimension and you're having an out-of-body experience. So all dream levels are OBEs, or out-of-body experiences. It's not just having a dream. And when you're dreaming, it's really a 5th-dimensional experience. So the dream that you think is fantasy is actually a reality on, let's say, the astral plane or any of the other dimensions. Most people think of the astral plane, although there are many other dimensions. So my point is that so people go out of the body every night. And here's an example. Let me demonstrate that. Let's say that I'm going to make a statement, and if any of your listeners want to argue with me or contradict me, you're welcome to email me. Here's the statement. Everybody out there, including you and your co-host, have had dreams of flying.
That's right.
Now, what are flying dreams? Flying dreams are when you're actually leaving the earth plane, when you're going to sleep at night, and you're going from the earth plane to the astral plane. Your soul leaves the body, just like an out-of-body experience, like you see on movies and TV shows, etc. Okay? And then another dream that's not as commonly remembered, but it is real, is you have a dream where you feel like you're falling into an abyss.
Yes.
You can hear a pin drop, okay?
Yes.
It's really weird, and you're falling, but you never splat. And what that is coming back from the astral plane or any other parts of the 5th dimension back to the earth plane when you awake the following morning, you see? So those dreams are remnants, what we call dream lifts or remnants of the out-of-body experience that the dream levels or the REM cycle represents, which is in alpha brainwave.
I never thought of it that way. That makes perfect sense because I clearly remember having both sets of dreams. The dream of falling is a very common dream, as you said. You're right. I think everybody out there has had that dream as well as flying.
Okay, so let's educate the audience about time travel. So let's talk about what we're dealing with here. So time travelers, or chrononauts, as I call them, they come from the 31st century to the 50th century. In the year approximately 3050, a man by the name of Tatos, T-A-A-T-O-S, will discover enlarging a wormhole to classic size and allowing that wormhole to classic size to be large enough to permit a craft with a team of chrononauts to travel back in time. So the first time travel experience will be in about 1,000 years by a man named Tatos. When he establishes that, he will take a team of him back in time, and the first place they go back to is ancient Egypt. So let me give you the names of his cohorts. This is the first time traveler team from the 31st century. Tatos, Geb, Isis, Osiris, and Set. That ring a bell?
Yes, that's right.
Those are the names of Egyptian gods. Everybody's heard of it, okay? And so the Egyptian gods, think of it. You're a time traveler, and you're going back in time, and you can do things like levitation and all these devices that they have, and you can do what we call quantum medicine. We'll discuss that in a little while. Then the people that you're the primitive that you're dealing with are going to worship you as a god. They're either going to kill you or worship you as a god.
You're right, and that would make perfect sense. And if you look in the Bible, for instance, you have so many instances of, for instance, angels coming from the sky or
Right.
weird craft. Obviously, if you were living in such primitive times and then you have something coming down, people are going to perceive it as a godlike creature because...
Well, also, the other thing about the biblical reference is that you notice how a lot of the patriarchs in the Bible live to be 900 plus years old, right?
Yes.
Okay, remember that? Okay, well, we don't do that very well today, but in the future, beginning with the 35th century, see, I'm going to reference my book, Time Travels from Our Future, because there's a very nice section in there where I talk about the greatest century in the history of mankind, which is the 35th century. Why is that great? It's because of the technological developments, and I'll give you one just a moment, but also it's a time when teleportation will be used to travel back in time. The reason why that's relevant is because when the time travelers from the 31st to the 34th century came back in time, they enlarged the wormholes, which causes a tear in the fabric of space-time every time they do that, and that's why we have a lot of weather problems and earthquakes and tsunamis and all kinds of fish falling from the sky. All those Fortean phenomena mentality are actually due to tears in the fabric of space-time. But here's a development. Speaking of the biblical references to the 900 plus. Adam was 930 some odd years old, and Noah's grandfather, the oldest man in history, 969, and then he died, Okay, so what happens? There's a device that's I call the alpha syncolarium. This is developed in about the 35th century, and what this does is that it sends a form of like light and sound through the body to increase the body's production of DHEA, which controls in its intermediary phase as a sex hormone our immune system, so that the average 35th century citizen lives between 500 and 900 years young. And that is an example of those patriarchs. Where would primitive man get the idea of 900 plus years for their patriarch? They wouldn't know that. How would they get that, okay? It wouldn't make any sense at all to them. Because nobody else did that. None of your other patriarchs and other biblical references and other religious documents talk about living 900 years, except the Old Testament.
Moses, exactly.
Well, but Moses did not live to be 900 years old. Moses was about 120 when he died.
Okay.
We're talking about Adam. We're talking about Noah's grandfather and
Noah, that's what I was thinking. 800,
not
yeah.
Moses was different guy, different
Yes.
dude. Okay? But still, 120 is still pretty good for 35
True.
years ago. Or actually, almost 4,000 years ago. So that's what that's all about. So let's talk about time travel. The first team, Tatos' team. And by the way, Tatos, his name was actually thought by the Egyptians, and the Greeks called him Hermes. So Tatos is a very important figure. He is the main dude. He's sort of like the Bill Gates of his time, okay? Because he was a philosopher, scientist, you name it, archaeologist, everything. Okay, the time travel team firstly consists of two grays. Okay, these were extraterrestrials, and we would call the Zeta Reticuli, or the Steven Spielberg alien, as you would call it. They have large black eyes, 3 to 5 feet tall, with grayish skin, no earlobes, 4 fingers and a toe. They can sometimes appear as little whites or blues, not just the grays. They're the kinder and gentler time traveler. Neither type has body hair, and they all wear one-piece uniforms, and this is critical now. They always have a triangular symbol in their uniform. If you ever see an ET, or any being, even if it looks human, that has a triangular symbol, that is a time traveler or a chrononaut from our future. They always use the triangle as their symbol.
That would make actually real sense with a recent book written by Helen Luttrell, Rachel's Eyes. They talked about the actual creature having, like you said, it had I don't remember which color they described, but it was a one-piece suit, and where the heart would be, somewhere on the chest, was a triangle.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now you can separate those from Zeta Reticuli from the current century, which wouldn't have a triangle on their suit. Okay? Now the second type is, so this is the first team. The typical team would have been 2 grays, 1 hybrid time traveler, and a hybrid time traveler is a mixture between humans and Zeta Reticuli, sometimes other ETs, and this is what they would look like. They would be about 5.5 feet tall. Their skin would range from whitish hues to bronze, I should say. And they look pretty human, but they have these large faceted eyes and odd-looking forehead, so the closer you get to a hybrid time traveler, the more you realize you're not in Kansas anymore, as they say. And then the head of the team would be a pure human. Now, I'm going to say something, and people are going to yell and scream, and just hang in there, folks, okay? Don't go crazy. Don't kill the messenger. The pure human that dominated most of the time travel team was a Caucasian man, and I'll tell you why the race is important. Between 6 to 7 feet tall, he would be blonde, blue-eyed, tanned, clean-shaven, have beards or mustaches, and always would be dressed in a white robe. Now, why were not the other races represented? They were. The problem was, if you go back in time to a primitive civilization and you were dark-skinned, they killed you. If you were blonde or Caucasian, especially the blonde hair, they worshipped you. Okay, so basically, they learned not to use the other races for the time travel team in the beginning, anyway. And then the ones that are not members of a team, but also you will see back in time as time travelers, these are the nasty ones. These are the reptilians. They're actually related genetically to the Zeta Reticuli. The Zeta Reticuli are actually an offshoot of the reptilians. The reptilian time travelers have vertical pupils, lizard-like skin. They're not for our best interest. They're cannibalistic. They have green, blue to gray to brown color skins. They're about 200 plus pounds. No wings, though, unlike the Draco types that you see in modern day or current day reptilians, if you ever see a reptilian. But they're cannibalistic, they're nasty, evil. They're usually like escaped criminals from the future that come back in time to escape the cops, so to speak, from their level. They're never good. If you ever see a reptilian time travel, get out of there, leave, because they're going to kill you and eat you. They're not fun people. So that's the initial time traveler team. And as I mentioned now, the mechanics of it, let's just talk about some more current day substantiation to time travel. One of the most brilliant men in the world today, a guy who out-debated, John, I don't want you to be offended, but he out-debated Stephen Hawking, okay, about the existence of black holes. His name was Kip Thorne. He's an astrophysicist at Caltech in Pasadena here in Southern California, Los Angeles.
Yeah, our home, actually, yeah.
Okay. Well, what Kip Thorne did was in Carl Sagan wrote the novel Contact that was made into a movie with
Jodie Foster. Yeah.
Okay. Well, he wanted to have his novel accurate, so Carl Sagan, the astronomer from Cornell, he contacted his good old buddy, the good old boy Kip Thorne. They were friends, and he said, "I'd like to make this novel accurate. So could you please do some research about enlarging wormholes, time travel, etc. Because time travel is part of the Contact novel." So Kip Thorne did an article published in the Physical Review Letter. This is an academic, hard-nosed, Coke bottle glass article, journal for physicists, okay? So this is a very respected scientific journal. It was published in September of 1988. Nobody has disavowed the article yet, and it gives the proof, the mathematical model to show how you can enlarge a wormhole. Now, we can't do it today, but they will. He says in there, Kip Thorne says that a advanced civilization will be able to do this, okay? And they will do it in 1,000 years. But he says you can enlarge a wormhole to classic size by lighting it with exotic matter, which has negative mass and moves forward in time. It's the opposite of antimatter. We don't have negative matter today, or what they call exotic matter. They're using super colliders to try to create it, but they've been failing miserably.
Like CERN, you mean, right?
Right, like at CERN in Switzerland, right? That's a good example. There are others, but that's a big one. So if you line it with exotic matter, he gives the mathematical model to show that we know the mechanics to do it. We just don't have the exotic matter, and we don't have the ability to enlarge a wormhole, which will disappear quickly as you approach it, and they're all microscopic in size. But in the future, in 1,000 years, Tatos will be able to do it. So we have the model. So this isn't just science fiction here. This is science. And so Kip Thorne does give the background to it. So those my time travel book does give Time Travels from Our Future book especially gives a lot of the no math in there, but it gives a nice description of how the astrophysics and the superspace and all the quantum mechanics works to show you how these become a reality. So this is the mechanics of how to do this. Now, one thing about time travelers, remember now, they're us in the future. These are not creepy people who just try to get sperm and egg samples and do an X-File episode. These are people to try to help us grow spiritually. And the reason being is because they have a self-interest. They're us in the future. So the more we screw up our world, the worse it is for the future. That's why they want to help us. You see? Now,
Bruce, it's John in London.
Yeah.
Do you have any scientific models to support time travel?
Yeah, well, like I say, Kip Thorne's, I reference in my Time Travel from My Future book, I give the scientific reference. People can look it up. You can get the Physical Review Letters article. It's online, and it gives the actual now, it's a very technical journal. If you don't have a calculus background, you're not going to be able to relate to it very well. But there are other examples of, if you're looking for some other examples of in a more lay mentality as to what I'm talking about, in my Time Travels from Our Future book, I have a nice little section where I discuss some of the researchers that have documented, if you will, the current theories without going into all the crazy math. Okay, so if you in the book I talk about how not only can you enlarge the wormholes, which of course is something that would definitely allow you to go back or forward in time. Okay, but I talk about the work of not just Kip Thorne, but Michael Morris, Olvi Yurtsever. They work together. Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time book also describes time travel. The brilliant physicist from the theoretical physicist from Princeton University, Edwin Witten, talks about a form of hyperspace travel through hyperuniverses by these futuristic humans. Okay, avoiding the need to have actual time machines per se. The research of South Carolina theoretical physicist Yakir Aronov, a former associate of David Bohm, is also described in there. So there are other references in there, including Frank Tipler with his development, and Groff and so others. So there's many examples of how time travel has been supported, at least theoretically, by these astrophysicists. You see, so it's not just my opinion. I'm using hard science here because that is my background. But one of the things that can be done, let me give you one of the techniques of time travel that I think is really cool. And this is called quantum medicine. And quantum medicine is something that, what they can do, because they're so advanced in their medicine. See, a time traveler or chrononaut goes through a very advanced training. They're not just trained to be the equivalent of astronauts, which they are, but they're also trained in medicine, and they're trained how, if they have injuries, if they have, deaths, whatever on their team, how they can avoid this or how they can treat them. And what they develop in the future is what we call quantum medicine, which says it's a very advanced form of technology which allows you to actually resuscitate a person who has died if you catch them within 24 hours of their physical death.
Really? So essentially, if your heart stops on today's day, say we take you to the hospital, they declare you dead within, say, 10, 15 minutes after trying to resuscitate you. But you're saying in the future with quantum medicine, literally once your heart stops in today's days, they would declare you dead. You could technically go up to 24 hours and they
now,
could resuscitate you.
When you talk about modern medicine today, you're talking about giving them electrocardio shock, that kind of. We're not talking about that. We're not talking also about the fact that you have a near-death experience, which is after 3 or 4 minutes, the brain is basically dead and you're not going to revive the person. We're talking about somebody who's now stiff. Okay, he's not quite fertilizing the lawn yet, but he's dead for 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 hours, okay? He's basically dead. No functions, no brain. The EEG is going to be flatline. This person is gone. Well, they have techniques, and they can also, by the way, regenerate lost limbs like a lizard, okay? They can do that, too, with their quantum thing. This is a very advanced form of science. Their science of healing and regeneration is a non-surgical approach, and it involves using the fourth and fifth dimensional states of matter and alternating magnetic fields with the use of light. And with a proper combination of color and sound, they will establish what they call a healthy resonance grid within the hydrogen matrix of life, allowing for the human expression of the DNA, RNA to be properly balanced. So therefore, and I know I'm trying to oversimplify it, but it's a way of not just pumping up the heart so it beats again, but actually recreating the whole life processes, the life force, the soul, or the prana, as the East Indians would call it, or the chi for the Chinese, or the ki for the Japanese, all the same term, so that the life force is actually revitalized, and that the person can now function again, and they can go out and run faster and jump higher and do what they did before. So this is called quantum medicine, and this is to me a brilliant achievement, which is and all the chrononauts are trained how to do that.
And actually, some people have been abducted. Not to mention, New Age groups talk about the healing qualities of lights, sound,
right.
even colors, as you mentioned, and even sense.
Well, the ancients have also referenced to this too. If you go back into study acupuncture, if you go back into study the mystery schools and their techniques, color and sound and light and sound are not exactly unknown. But let me just review some of the characteristics of what time travelers can do.
Yes.
They can travel through what we call hyperspace and move interdimensionally. Okay? They can move through solid objects, so a time travel can appear in your dreams, which they do, and they can actually influence both scientific and artistic accomplishments. What's a very interesting scientific fact, remember, I'm not forgetting my scientific background, 80% of scientific discoveries and artistic brilliant achievements have been done because of people dreamt about things and then did it the following day. And that's actually, many of those interactions, those breakthroughs, are actually due by time travelers communicating with you. A time traveler can remain invisible by functioning at a frequency, vibration, or rate far beyond us, so they can act like a guardian angel. And I'll give you an example of a case history in a few moments to show you that, to illustrate that. When we were aboard one of their crafts, or if they're involved in a military base, and now we have a conspiracy aspect because all the governments know about time travelers, they just won't brag about it, to us anyway. They can use holograms to show us our past and future, including past and future lives, because a lot of time travelers communicate with us throughout our lifetimes. They actually trace us from our past lives, so our reincarnations. Okay, they can, if a time traveler is dealing with a difficult situation, like somebody's about to shoot you or kill you, they can put the perpetrator into a state of suspended animation, and all communication with him at that time would be telepathic. All right. They have also, I mentioned about the quantum medicine. So these are examples of some of the things that a time traveler can do. Now, they can do the things that look like current-day ETs, meaning that because there's ETs on their team, usually the Greys are the ones that are sent out to get people when they need to abduct them. But they abduct them for not just reasons of sperm and egg samples. That's for the Greys that are basically infertile. But they're also trying to help us grow spiritually. So here's an example. Here's a quote from one of my case histories.
Okay.
At precisely 3 a.m., I was alone in the house and awakened by an electrical feeling, a zap on the nape of my neck. There in the bedroom door was a figure dressed in a white robe standing more than 6.5 feet tall. "What do you want?" I said, and to that he shook his head as if to say nothing and sparkled into nothingness. Yes, this experience inspired me to evolve spiritually. So they dematerialized. They went back into their craft or their time period if it was a 35th century time traveler. So this is an example of what they can do. Now, I mentioned about doing an angelic aspect, and I just want to briefly describe one of my cases of an angel case. Remember now, I'm not saying there aren't angels. There are. Okay, my work in my Spirit Guide Contact Through Hypnosis book will document examples of angels. So I'm not against angels, but a time traveler can act as one. Way back over 20 years ago, one of my patients was walking down a street in the busy downtown area of Miami on her way to do some clothes shopping, right? All of a sudden, a car came screeching by. And if you know downtown Miami, it's a high crime area, okay? We're not talking about Miami Beach now. This is downtown area, okay? All of a sudden, the car came by screeching right in front of her, and in it were a group of teenage boys, gangbangers basically, with automatic weapons, and they threatened to shoot her and several other people that were in the area. Just as they were about to shoot her and the other pedestrians, she froze and doesn't recall what happened, and her watch stopped, and everything electrical stopped. And what happened was a time traveler simply came down, froze, put in suspended animation the gangbangers, okay, removed the other people from the scene, so they were safe, took the weapons away from the gangbangers, all right, then got them out of suspended animation, and they didn't know what was going on, and they sped by, and my patient as well as all the other pedestrians were saved.
They drove off without their weapons. I couldn't imagine what was going on in their minds. They were about to do a drive-by, and then their weapons are gone.
Yeah, when you freeze up and you all of a sudden don't know where you are, and everything is freaking out, you want to get the hell out of there. I mean, that is you don't want to sit there and go, let's have a cup of coffee at Starbucks, okay? You want a 23 Skidoo. But that's an example of a time travel acting as a guardian angel. Now, in the future, I told you the 35th century is my favorite century because it's not just my favorite, but it's a century where the greatest developments are going to be achieved, and also the greatest spiritual achievements. By that time, people are going to be very, there's going to be no diseases, cancer and AIDS are cured. They're going to live to be 500 to 900 years old. They're going to have, they work maybe 15 hours a week. People have a lot of free time. They can do what they want. But here's a couple of examples of three of the very significant developments. I talked about the alpha syncholarium, which is a device that looks like an isolation tank, and it sends energy signals and sound to the body and allows you to live to be between 500 and 900 years old. Then there's something that I call the this is a food simulator that allows you to create any meal you want from your thoughts alone. And I call this a mind witch machine. So it looks like a microwave. So let's say you want to have the proverbial chicken sandwich, or in your case, John, fish and chips, okay? And you send the thought out to the machine. The machine goes on, creates the food, which is synthetic, but very healthy, and you won't gain weight. You can eat as much as you want, and that's called the mind witch machine, or a food simulator. The other thing they do is they have what they call an amusement park. Now, we have amusement parks, and I'm sure you know Europe, you have Disneyland and all those places. Their amusement parks are what we call anti-gravity amusement parks, and they're dedicated to Tatos. It's called the Land of Tatos. And what it is, it floats several thousand feet above the earth, and it has a force field around it so people won't fall off the edge if they want to do something stupid. And what they do at the amusement park is not rides, but they go there and they say, I want to go back to the Renaissance. So they're guided with a host, like a host, to go back in time so they don't do something stupid, but they're actually be able to go back or even forward in time from the Land of Tatos amusement park. So those are three examples. And by the 26th century, every home on our planet will have a teleportation machine, which will work locally, so you could.
Wait, did you say 26 or 36th
26. By
Okay, so
26,
600
we're going to
years.
have teleportation. Now, teleportation will be used for transportation locally mostly, but it won't be used for time travel until the 35th century. Okay? Time travel is a lot more exotic than just going from one place, one location to another. Now, patients of mine have reported actual feelings. Would you like to know what teleportation actually feels like?
Absolutely.
Okay, this is an actual report. This comes from my book, Past Lives, Future Lives Revealed, which gives a case of a future life progression of a gentleman who will become a time traveler in the future, which I thought was kind of an interesting concept, and the only time I ever treated a patient like that who had time travel future. But this is what he described. He's describing his own example of teleportation because this was the 36th century, and time travel was used to go back in time. Quote, "It was as though something twisted my body. It felt almost like I was caught in a giant web. Suddenly, the world exploded into countless billions of glowing threads. I could now perceive that the strange twisting sensation that I was experiencing as correlated with the motion of these threads, and they were in constant motion. I was also aware of things beyond the room. The overall effect was similar to looking at a hologram, except it was visceral as well as visual. You could see and feel the image. Part of me was totally confused, and another part was completely familiar with whatever this was. There was a very odd sense of my consciousness being split. Two contradictory thoughts were present in my mind simultaneously." That is what teleportation feels like. In fact, in my Time Travels from My Future book, I give you an example. Well, actually, my Exploring the Fifth Dimension book is also relevant. I gave an example of my own use of my own teleportation technique, and I can testify that description I just read is very relevant. If your listeners want to do teleportation, I would recommend they go to my site and order my Time Travelers training program. It's a 6-title CD album, which will take them from simple to more complicated experiences of out-of-body travel, and the last title is going to be teleportation. It's a very difficult technique, the hardest thing to do in hypnosis, but believe me, it's a trip, and it's really kind of cool. And the two countries I was talking before we went on the air, England and Argentina, for some reason, are the two countries with the greatest percentage and number of cases of teleportation, of what we call spontaneous teleportation.
Johnny actually has a question. This is from this is a London question from Facebook. Go ahead and ask it, and then I have another question which goes back to fairly on in the beginning of the show. I didn't want to interrupt you on the role because it was such an awesome role, an educating role. Go ahead, Johnny, and then I'm going to ask this question here from the States.
Okie dokie. Well, this is a Facebook question from Bill in Highbury, North London, England, and he asked the doctor, you advocate OBE, out-of-body experience, I assume, but is there anything that you can mention of the celestial cord and the effects and safety of not breaking this cord while experiencing an OBE?
Okay, well, he's talking about the silver cord. He calls it a celestial cord. That would be more angelic in reference, but that's okay. It's called a silver cord. It's been reported for like thousands of years, and what that means is that when you leave the body, the silver cord is attached to the back of your head, so you normally don't see it unless you spin around or watch somebody else's silver cord. You're never going to have that severed. It's only severed at the moment of clinical death. So as long as you see a silver cord, it's like an umbilical cord. It actually attaches to your higher self and gives you a consciousness stream, which allows to keep you alive, including your spiritual body. But yes, the silver cord will always be attached unless you're actually crossing into spirit and going to reincarnate into a future life. Then the silver cord will be severed. I've done over 3,000 out-of-body experiences. If it was dangerous, I would be speaking from you from the astral plane. Okay, I'm not. So it's perfectly safe. And I told you, do it every night. Every night you go out of the body and you spend about 3 hours in the REM cycle. We know that from neurology or dream laboratory studies. And those 3 hours are broken up into 4 or 5 sleep cycles. So you're out of the body 3 hours a night. This is just a more conscious ability to remember it. Now, if your listener there wants to, and this applies to the audience, if they want to have their own conscious memories of out-of-body experience, as I mentioned earlier, if they order any of my books from my site, from my homepage, from my office, not at a bookstore, you have to order from my office, from my site, and they will get the book itself signed, of course, and they will get a free fifth dimensional travel CD, which will guide them out of the body into the fifth dimension, and all the techniques we're describing would be relevant. They can meet time travelers, they can go into the past and future, they can meet a Pleiadian or other a more advanced level and positive ET, they can meet their spirit guides or departed loved one, they can do any of the things that we discuss and more with perfect safety, because I always have spiritual protection techniques, white light techniques, and others on these CDs, times myself by using my CDs. So obviously it's quite safe.
This goes back to the very beginning of the show when you were describing the fact that we're in fifth dimension when we're out of body and
well, we live in the fifth dimension now. Let me explain. We live in a three-dimensional world that our eyes are conditioned by evolution to perceive, length, width, and breadth, or depth.
Yes.
However, we live, superimposed upon us, is the fifth dimension. Fourth dimension is time, according to the physicist. And anything beyond the fourth dimension is the fifth dimension, which will include not only the astral, mental, causal, etheric, and soul plane and others, but also parallel universes. That's also part of the fifth dimension. So we live in it. We just can't see it unless you go out of the body or use the hypnotic technique to go beyond the physical body into your astral body and use your astral senses to sense the fifth dimension.
And this is exactly sort of what George was asking. He says, the movie Interstellar, he said, what were your thoughts of the fifth dimension depiction in that?
Well, I'm never thrilled with Hollywood depiction of anything. Okay, with all due respect, hypnosis is pictured by Hollywood as either something a vampire does or, like remember the TV series The Mentalist?
Yes.
You ever watch that? Okay.
Yes.
Well, it was a complete scam. You can't do any of the things the guy did. He said he snaps his fingers, the person's out of it, and all of a sudden he's replicating. This is ridiculous. They do things that are always exaggerated. So the principle is nice, but don't look for Hollywood when it comes to academic accuracy when it comes to a technique. Okay, so, but I want to give you a case history of teleportation. Not only have I done that myself to test the technique, but I've also trained people to do that. So I want to give you a case that I report in my Exploring the Fifth Dimension book. This is a case, I call her Vivian, not her real name. She is a female patient living in Los Angeles, and what she was doing, she came to me, she had a lot of problems, very depressed and all kinds of issues. She was dating a real jerk, a guy who was physically and psychologically abusive, okay? And so one fine day, they're in the car in the freeway, in one of the Los Angeles freeways. They get into an argument, and he literally throws her out of the car on the freeway going 75 miles an hour, which is not a bright thing to do.
No, it's almost fatal. That would be normal.
Well, it was, she rolled, okay? Now, I should tell you before that I trained her how to do hypnosis and how to do, all my patients are trained how to do self-hypnosis, and we were also working on teleportation. So I gave her a post-hypnotic instruction or suggestion how to do teleportation, which is not easy to apply, especially in a panic state. So now she lands on the freeway, she twists her ankle, so now she's gimpy, okay? And there's a car coming in the opposite direction about to hit her, going 70-plus miles an hour. So all she can think of is my post-hypnotic instruction to teleport, because she's going to die. She's going to be hit by a car 75 miles an hour. The next thing she knows, she's on her living room couch with a very sore ankle. The car that was going to hit her went through her, okay? And the guy, of course, stopped his car, and he didn't know what was going on, and her boyfriend didn't either. And she teleported from the freeway back to her apartment, which was several miles away, instantaneously by using the teleportation technique that she was trained to use. By the way, later on, she broke up with this idiot. Be working with her. She met another gentleman, and about a year later, they got married, and they've got a couple of kids, and they're happily ever after, thank God. But she would have died. More importantly than the relationship, she was going to die. I don't take credit for saving her life. I didn't. It was her higher self, and her. I just trained her to use teleportation, and you might say her higher self kind of like probably acted in a little bit more extreme way to save her life. She wasn't supposed to die at that time. But that's an example of teleportation in a personal example. What the most documented case, by the way, of teleportation, which I report in my Time Travels from My Future book, is a man who came. This was 1593. Now let's go back in time a little bit. You know that 1593 was the age of exploration. Spain, one of the original explorer mentalities, they owned the Philippines and Mexico were colonies of theirs, right?
Yes.
So there's a gentleman in Manila. He's a guard for the governor in 1593. It's October 24th. And who remembers the dates, right? And all of a sudden, he disappears from Manila. He winds up in the Mexico City Plaza in Mexico City. Now, I should tell you that the Mexican government, their soldiers and their uniforms and their guns are very different than the ones from the continent. So a Spanish soldier and gun would be very different than a Mexican soldier with his gun. He appears in the square. He's immediately arrested because, they said, who are you? Where's your, you got a Spanish outfit on and there's nobody else here except you. What are you doing here? What are you, a spy? What's going on? They arrest him. They take him into jail, and he's interrogated by the police. So now we have historical documentation to this. And they said, what's going on? He was very nervous, and he goes, I tried to save the governor. He was murdered. I was one of the guards, and I really tried my best, but we were outnumbered. And they said, the governor of what? The governor was fine. He said, Manila, Philippines. And the guy says, that's 9,000 miles away. When did this happen? He said, a few hours ago. He said, you're local. So they put him in jail. And then they had the police come in because they wanted to do an exorcism. Remember, this is 1593, Spanish Inquisition time, right?
Yes.
So the priest comes in here, and they work with him, and of course nothing happens. 2 months later, it's Christmas time. It takes about 2 months for ships to go from the Philippines to Mexico. Spain would, they would go around the world with their colonies and give supplies and bring the news items, as they would do their thing. So 2 months later, it's now Christmas time. The ship comes into the harbor in Mexico City, or by it. And the guy comes in there and he says, by the way, we got some news to tell you about. The governor of the Manila was murdered. And they said, when? And they said, October 24th. And they said, really? October 24th? We have somebody we'd like to show you in jail. They take him to the jail. He recognizes the guard.
Really?
He said, that's one of the guards. So they eventually put him back on the ship and let him go back to Manila. Now, this was documented by the Catholic Church because of the exorcism attempt anyway. It was documented by the police department because they have historical records. So now we have the most documented case of teleportation. You don't go from Manila to Mexico City, which is 9,000 miles away, in a matter of a few seconds unless you teleport. And by the way, he teleported back in time because he arrived back on the evening of the 23rd of October by leaving from the morning of the 24th. So it's like 12 hours back in time when he teleported. When you teleport, you will go back or forward in time, usually, by the way.
And not to mention, that for that to happen 423 years ago, exactly. For that to have happened then, and that much documentation, as you said, you can't go 9,000 miles in a few seconds, few hours, or even a few days. You would need a boat. There was no airplanes or anything like that. The only possibility would
and there's no internet either. Okay, so you're not going to Google something.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So that's an example. So my point is teleportation. And by the way, just for people that I've teleported several times, and many of my patients have. Let me just tell you something that you don't have to worry about. You're not going to teleport underwater and drown. You're not going to teleport in the middle of a mountain or in the middle of a building. You're going to teleport on the earth, and you're going to be in an environment where you're perfectly safe. All the cases, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds of teleportation cases, several of which I document in my books, especially the Time Travels from Our Future book. Many of them were religious figures initially, but then there were others, lay people, all over the world. I told you Argentina and England have some of the greatest number of cases. So this is not so uncommon a phenomena. And the way we explain that, at least the way I explain it, and I'm sure Kip Thorne wouldn't have a problem with it either, is that because the time travels from our future come back in time and cause tears in the fabric of space-time, that's going to be like a hole. And that's when people just walk along the street and all of a sudden they enter into a tear in the fabric of space-time, which is invisible to our eyes. You'd have to use your fifth-dimensional senses to see it. Then you will immediately zip from one location to another, and that, by definition, is teleportation. It's not an out-of-body experience. You are actually physically moving your body from one location to another.
Dr. Goldberg, it's Johnny Webb in London again. We're getting more questions coming in on Facebook.
Sure.
One of them is from Pascal in Paris, France, and he asks, who's in control of time travel in our present time? Is there a Ministry of Time Travel like in Hogwarts in a Harry Potter movie?
Again, here we go at Hollywood again. Okay. All right. No, there is no Ministry of Time Travel. There is, however, governments in the future, especially U.S. government, using different locations to have the time travel team. The chrononauts are sort of like our astronauts. Astronauts are military people, right? They work for the government, right? The federal government. Well, the chrononauts are established so that the United States doesn't exist as a country in the 35th century. Okay, it's more universal. The countries that we know today don't really exist in the future.
It's kind of New World Order, you would say, things, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like think of like the Federation. Okay, more likely rather than us here. But they're all democratically run, by the way. Anyway, so there is more of a worldwide association with this. But what we consider to be America today, we are the forerunners of the Tatos, et cetera, and the development of time travel, and then we share it with the rest of the world so that it becomes more of a universal approach. And they control the time travel. Now, the problem with that, sometimes, like the reptilians, they sneak into places and they're absolutely able to go back in time to escape the justice system in their mentality. But that's a rare case. There aren't that many that do that. Mostly it's controlled by, let's say, the government, so that people can do it more appropriately. Even the land of Tatos, the amusement park, which allows you to go back in time, that's also under government control. They supervise it so that people don't do it for nefarious purposes.
I was going to say we got to take a break in under 10 minutes, and just be a short break. So everybody out there with your questions, don't nobody go nowhere in classic terms. Nonetheless, I'm going to go back to ask you something. This is Tanya from Seattle. Okay, now I'm going to put my preface before I ask her question. We obviously know the purpose of the time travelers protecting us, because if we screw up our planet now, then obviously it's going to affect them in 1,500 years or 2,000 years, whatever it be. Her question is, what is the purpose of the reptilians' time travel if we're to avoid them?
Okay, well, the reptilians, think of it this way. Let's say that you are El Chapo.
Yes, the
drug
gangster,
dealer, cartel guy, right?
That's right.
The guy who likes to escape. The Harry Houdini of the drug cartel world. So let's say you're a reptilian in the future, and you're being booked and printed for murder and cannibalism and everything else, or espionage, whatever. They are nasty people. So somehow, in some way, you are able to time travel back in time. You're just escaping justice, because here they wouldn't have your fingerprints, they wouldn't have any records of you. Of course, a reptilian would stand out. But some of these are shapeshifters, so they can look human. You see, that's another problem with them. Okay, so basically they're just trying to escape justice. That's all. They're criminals. They're evil. They're never part of a time traveler team like the criminals that I'm describing. They're just simply escapees, like the El Chapos, and they're evil, nasty, and you don't want anything to do with them.
That would make sense because obviously, some people even say that they feast on us, and that's why you said when we.
No, they're cannibalistic. I mean, the reason why you don't hear when you hear about when you hear about ET abductees or people who cite extraterrestrials, you will normally hear the Greys, the majority of them, especially in America, in the Western Hemisphere. You will hear about the Pleiadians occasionally, okay, and you will hear about the. So those are the two major groups. There are many other groups, but those are the ones that get most of the attention. The reason why you don't hear about reptilian abductions or reptilian interactions is because they eat their mistakes. They will kill people and eat them, so not too many people are going to be witnesses to survive to report. Remember the Dulce, New Mexico, where they had that uprising in 1979?
With the ETs versus the United States military.
Reptilians. It was Greys and reptilians that were there. They were doing the killings, remember? That was the report that we get from, we don't have any videotapes of this, but there were a lot of reptilians that were in that base, or the underground base, with the Greys. Remember, they're genetically related.
That's right. There's actually 3 different types of extraterrestrials in Dulce, from what I hear. One level has one type of Greys, another level has another type of Greys, and then, of course, the reptilians.
The farther you descend down, the worse the Greys are, the worse the ETs are, okay? They keep the really nasty ones at the bottom levels, or the lower levels. So.
And I heard rumors, especially from a book called UFO Highway, which details about Dulce, that the last 2 levels, levels 6 and 7, are off limits for humans, which would make sense, like you said, the worst.
We give them their own little, their own little duchy there. They have their own little. That's the deal that we made. Remember, the deal that was made with Eisenhower, technically, if you go back in time, was the idea of the Greada Treaty, which is that we'll let you abduct citizens, give us technology. That was the deal with the devil that we made back in 1952 or 4 or
54, yeah, right. Muroc Airfield, currently known as Edwards now, right? The meeting.
Right.
Yeah.
Eisenhower was on Palm Springs and golfing, and an Army guy came up and said, "Mr. President, we have a ride for you up to Edwards. We got something to show you." And when he rode at the base, he saw like a big UFO in the driveway, the equivalent of a driveway. And he rose into the meeting room. There's a bunch of generals there, and there's also a couple of Greys. So he knew that he wasn't in Kansas anymore either. But that's the theory. I mean, no one's going to admit that in the government, but So that's a good question, though, Tanya. I hope that if you're still here, that it's a good question, and it's because people think that if you have time travel in the wrong hands, you can go back and do a Back to the Future Part 2 mentality,
Yes, exactly. Now, I'm going to ask a couple more before we take our break here. Let's go back to, actually, let me ask you about the various methods of time travel. Wow.
Okay.
How many different methods are there, and can you describe some of them?
Okay, well, I'm going to divide time travel into 6 categories, okay? I'll make it simple. The first one is physical time machines. Now, forget about the movie The Time Machine, I mean, That's a little different. But there are devices, theoretically, we can't do that because the energy to do that would be just exotic. We have to tap into the sun. But Kip Thorne and Tipler and Frank Tipler from New Orleans came up with actual models of actual machines that could do that. Okay. The second type is what we call enlarging the wormholes. Now, Tatos developed this by what's called the WLA, which stands for the Wormhole Linear Accelerator, which is a device that enlarges these microscopic wormholes so that they don't disappear when you look at them, and that you can actually get a craft and team in there. So that's the second type. The third type is, of course, just fifth-dimensional travel. When people use like the fifth-dimensional travel CD I talk about that they get free if they order one of my books, you can actually go out of the body. When you go out of the body into the fifth dimension, you can go into the past and the future. So that's the third type. The fourth type, of course, is what I mentioned before, is teleportation, which is beginning in the 35th century. There's a device they put on their belt that looks like an old transistor radio. It's a small little device, and they push a few buttons, whatever, and it goes through a very complicated procedure, and they actually teleport without using a craft. They could just teleport one-on-one, mano-on-mano, and go back or forward in time. The fifth type is what a man by the name Professor Gott did. He calls these cosmic strings. It's a very theoretical physics mentality. Your listeners can look it up. It's a little technical, but these very large cosmic strings, like STRING, when they pass over each other, you can travel back or forward in time. And Gott's theory is very, very viable, but it's very technical, so I'd rather them look it up. I can't explain that in 2 seconds.
Yes.
And then Ron Mallett described this idea of bending light to manipulate time. He's a physicist, too, from, I believe it's Midwest, Michigan, I believe, or Minnesota. And he describes how you can bend light to manipulate time. So all those are the various types. The ones that we focus here on is the wormhole linear accelerator from Tatos for about 400 years, and then teleportation beginning in the 35th century.
I'm actually glad you brought up the bending light, because there has been several cases. I remember Linda Moulton Howe talking about a case, I believe it was in North Dakota, where a craft was coming and it was shooting beams down, and these beams seemed to be bending. It was really crazy. But with that being said, everybody stay tuned. We're going to take a quick break. We come back another full hour with Dr. Bruce Goldberg. So much more. Just stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I'm Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol, England, former BBC journalist on BBC Radio, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
I'm Jack Osborne, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio.
My name is Mike Gravel, former senator from Alaska. You're listening to Dr. J Radio.
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
As you heard it from our good friends, we are back to Hour 2 of Dr. J Radio Live. Those are just some guests, some of the very many guests, and of course the last one being Art Bell, good friend, and of course I worked as producer for a little time while he came out of his retirement for just a few short months. Nonetheless, we are back with an incredible guest, Dr. Bruce Goldberg, speaking on some very important topics that are very true to my heart and of course to many of you guys out there listening. This is exactly why we booked him and why he's been on my list for so long. This is why I decided to extend the show today, specifically because there's so much to cover. But before we do so, Dr. Goldberg, if you can, now would be a perfect time to plug in all your websites. I know drbrucegoldberg.com, and anything else you'd like to say for everybody out there listening, where to visit.
Sure. Okay, the website is DR for doctor, DR, BRUCEGOLDBERG.com. And if they order any of my books and mention the show now, they have to mention the show and the offer, they will get an autographed copy. Of course, if they order the book, they pay for it online, they get an autographed copy of the book. And with that book, if they mention the offer, they will get a free fifth-dimensional travel CD, which will guide them into the fifth dimension and do all the things we're discussing tonight. Those people, especially American audience, if they want to call my office, 1-800-KARMA-4U or 1-800-527-6248 is the toll-free number. And my website, by the way, is really kind of fun. It's free. You can go on there. You can see I have exercises on there, including the fifth-dimensional travel and teleportation. You can see what it looks like. I have videos of me actually doing sessions of patients of mine, including time travel abductees, AT abductees, people going to past and future lives. There's also many articles on there and a whole bunch of other material to let them orient to the field and to let's see what's going on. And, of course, all my books and CDs are described in detail there, too. And so, like I say, the key issue here is that they have to mention the offer. They mention the show and the offer. They get the free fifth-dimensional travel CD and of course, with the book. Now, also, many of the people, because of what we're dealing with today, the most relevant CD album I have is called the Time Travelers Training Program, which has 6 different titles, and the last one being teleportation. It goes into all kinds of out-of-body training, etc., and spiritual protection techniques. If they want to travel into past and future lives, my Hypnotic Time Travel CD album does that. If they want to practice on ascension techniques, I have a special album for that. Custom Design Your Own Destiny is an album program, a 6 CD album, which goes into training you to go into parallel universes, so you can see the universes that are exactly the same as we have today physically, except the events are different. So you can be very happy or unhappy and see how your life can be changed literally by switching parallel universes. And you can do that. I call that the New You technique. So all these techniques and more are illustrated on the site. And those of you that are interested in my presentations, I have about 13 different workshops I do. So if any of your groups out there want to hire me to speak, I give a summary of the various kinds of presentations I do too.
I would imagine hearing you speak at an event would be really awesome. I was blown away at all these topics. I knew what we were going into, but I didn't know how in depth we knew. You were truly an expert.
If they go on YouTube, several of my my workshops are on YouTube. Actually, they can see those for free. The full workshops, MUFON workshops I've given, and many of my radio interviews on Coast to Coast with George Norrie. They're on there. There's about 15 of them on there, and other interviews I've done. So they can actually get a feel as to some of my workshops on time travelers and time travel are actually online with YouTube. If you just put my name in the search engine, they'll get it.
Let me ask you this, going back in time. Now, of course, no pun intended, referring to with time machines and time travel. How was the past affected? Past civilizations, for instance, Atlantis, which a lot of people think is still a myth, and you have two sides to that coin.
Right.
Egypt, which was this, I guess you could say, the central part of the world 4,000 years ago. I would imagine it's not as nearly the Sahara Desert. It was not nearly as arid, dry as it is now. Then I would imagine it would have been very lush, a place where civilization can thrive. But how did time travel, how has it influenced the past civilizations?
Okay, well, we have to go back 200,000 years ago. Now, this is going to be what's called forbidden archaeology, and this is going to be not conventional. This is not politically correct. This is sort of like the Donald Trump version of metaphysics, okay? Anti-establishment. Okay, 200,000 years ago, Lemuria, which was as close to a perfect civilization as you can get. The Lemurian continent is in the Pacific Ocean. Current-day Hawaii today would be the middle of the old Lemurian continent. It was a giant continent, like 3,000 miles across, almost the size of that state. And that lasted from 200,000 years ago to about 10,500 BC or 11,000 BC. Now, they colonized, after about 100,000 years, around 100,000 BC, Lemuria developed a colonial mentality. So John in England could relate to colonialism. Yes. And their first major colony was Atlantis, which is in the Atlantic Ocean. I'm sure your listeners know what that is.
Yes.
And then they both of them became a little bit competitive after that. So then around about 25,000 BC, give or take, they decided to colonize Egypt. Now, what happened was Atlantis settled in the northern part of Egypt, which is what we call Cairo today, and the northern part. What was called in the old days Lower Egypt, because the Nile flows from south to north. The lower part of Egypt, where bordering like Sudan and places today, which would have been called Upper Egypt by Egyptologists today, was colonized by the Lemurians. Lemurians also colonized India, too. India was very Lemurian. Okay, so what happened is that there was a problem. They had like a civil war. The Atlanteans were very militaristic, almost like the ancient Romans, and they tried to conquer each other in all kinds of problems. In fact, India, in the old Rama Empire, which was, again, originally a Lemurian civilization, Atlantis tried to conquer it, and they actually had nuclear weapons. And the Mahabharata, if you ever read the old epic poem from East India, they will tell you about, they will give you quotes of a nuclear war that went on.
Yeah, you're right. They talk about the fact that an explosion with like 10,000 suns.
Right. And of course, how elephants are dematerializing or vaporizing. You know, all this stuff is. I give the quotes, by the way, in my Time Travel in my Future book from the Mahabharata. So if they want to read the actual references, it's in there. Anyway, so because they were killing each other and nuclear wars going on here, so the time travelers realized that their civilization isn't going to last real well if they keep this up. So they decide to come back in time and to square things up. So eventually, of course, Egypt was unified around 3100 BC by the Scorpion King, Nor-Aha, as it's called. And forget about the movie, okay? That's not based on reality. But Atlantis and Lemuria were involved with ancient Egypt, and in fact, they had to be settled. Their wars had to be, shall we say, politically. The State Department, the equivalent thereof, was actually the time travel from our future. So they had to settle it down so that people wouldn't kill each other and destroy our civilization. Because Egypt right now is really the source. I mean, obviously it's Lemuria, but the more conventional archaeology would I'm sure, not disagree with me. Egypt is the source. The first monarchs, Egyptian women in ancient Egypt were allowed to have community property rights. No ancient civilization did that. In fact, nobody did that until us relatively recently. So Egypt gave us everything: our technology, our astrology, astronomy, our sciences, medicine. 4000 BC, Egypt, not only did they have physicians practicing real medicine, but they had medical schools, while everybody else was living in caves. And they had 35 specialties, including ophthalmology, neurology, dentistry. Everything was involved. So Egypt was one hell of a civilization. But again, it was custom designed by Lemuria. Initially, with, of course, Atlantis thrown in there, too. So that's the story of time travel. They were involved in all the civilizations. China, the Persian Empire, Greece, you name it. All of them were, if you ever read about the sea peoples from Egypt that conquered a lot of the Mediterranean countries, the Mediterranean area, the sea people, by historians, they never identified who they were. Well, they were Atlanteans. Because when Atlantis went down about 11,000 BC, 10,500, give or take, they didn't kill all of them.
That's right.
Many of them escaped.
They had to have lived, survived. Yeah, there had to be some survival.
They became the sea people. And they think they were actually they lived around the Mediterranean, and they feel the Phoenicians were also part of the Atlantean aspect too, because they were the greatest sailors ever. They went all over the world, when nobody else was doing that before the age of exploration, So those are examples of how the time travelers were interacting, trying to keep the peace. Now, what I'd like to do is I want to just go over a couple of case histories to show you examples of how some of my patients who have had interactions with time travelers and how they have grown spiritually as a result. One of my patients, I call her Wendy. This is described in the Time Travels from Our Future book. She was abducted in between sessions with me. In other words, she'd see me on a Monday, and by the end of the week, the next thing she'd know, she'd be aboard a craft or even in a military base, hence the conspiracy aspect, in between sessions. And she was telling me, I said, well, describe what's going on. She goes, well, I don't know what to do. I mean, this guy in the white robes, this is the Caucasian, this was the head of the team. He was interviewing her in like a conference room on a military base, showing her holograms of her past and how she had all these problems with compulsive eating and depression. And I said, well, what else is going on? She goes, well, as he's showing me past lives and all these issues where I've had all these problems, he's getting very emotional, where he's almost crying. And I said, really? And I said, why don't you ask him what's going on? And she goes, I can't do that because all communication is telepathic. I said, sure you can. So she goes, okay, I'll do that. So then during the next session, a couple of weeks later, the next session, she's abducted by the time traveler. She's on the team, right? She's in this conference room. And she looks at the time traveler and telepathically she goes, "Why are you so emotional when you show me all these past lives of mine in which I got killed and murdered and abandoned, etc.?" So he looks at her and he says, because you are my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother.
Interesting.
They're allowed to work with their ancestors. Now, what he told her at the end of when he stopped doing the abductions, she was about 35, early 30s. He said, "Now look, in the future, you're going to meet a man, and he's going to have red hair and a white Corvette, okay? And I want you to pay very careful attention to this relationship." This woman was single, never married, okay? And had terrible relationships. So about a year and a half after the sessions were over, she contacts me, and she says, "Doctor, this is Wendy," not her real name, and she goes, "I want you to know that I just got engaged to Frank, and Frank has red hair, drives a white Corvette, and now they have a couple of kids, by the way. This case was done like 15 years ago. And one of these days, their kids are going to have kids, and they're going to have kids, and one of them is going to be a time traveler, a chrononaut."
That's actually someone that you've actually worked with. I couldn't imagine that.
I feel like this is your life. You know, I mean, this is your future life. In another case, a woman named, I call her Tina. Both her and her son were abducted many times, and the son had these nosebleeds, which is, by the way, a sign of implants, etc. And they were taken to a military base, and she was abducted when she was about 16 years old. She was a virgin, and she goes to her gynecologist, and she's having all these problems, and they said, "You're pregnant." They did the test, and they said, "You're pregnant." She goes, "How? I've never had sex." And they said, "Look, all we know is you're pregnant." So about 2 months later, she goes back. She's no longer pregnant. Okay?
Because the baby was taken out, obviously.
Right, but there was no bleeding. There was no, if a woman gets a spontaneous abortion, there's going to be a lot of tissue coming down.
Correct.
Okay, right?
Yes.
Nothing. Okay, so she figures, what the hell is going on? So they think she thinks she's crazy, So now we fast forward her in time by about 18 years now. She's abducted for the umpteenth time. She's taken to a military base. They speak with her telepathically, namely the time travelers, the chrononauts. They show her a hybrid daughter, half human, half ET, and her name is Anna, and that's the baby that was taken from her when she was 16 years old.
Her daughter. That was showing her daughter.
Well, it's a hybrid, obviously.
Yeah.
They took the, you know what I mean? They
human DNA. The embryo and combined it with
right. So
ET DNA.
So she was an example she is the mother of a hybrid, which will most likely be a hybrid time traveler in the future. So that's an example of 2 cases where people are abducted. But again, the purpose of all this is very spiritual. Both of them made a lot of clinical benefits as a result of this. So it wasn't just like, post-traumatic stress disorder here. Okay.
Dr. Goldberg, it's Johnny Webb in London again. We're getting another Facebook question, and it's from Justin in Middlesbrough, England. He asks, when using hypnosis, can you explain and elaborate what the sequence of events is of a physical death and then reincarnation through the eyes of an hypnotic patient?
Okay, right. Well, what happens is that they do a lot of out-of-body experience. Remember, now, this is what I work with patients for, like ascension techniques or spiritual growth. The mechanism is reincarnation. Reincarnation is out-of-body travel. So let me tell you what happens. You're about to clinically die. You have cancer or old age or heart attack, whatever it is. Now your consciousness is going to separate. Your soul, the subconscious mind, which is an alpha brainwave level medically, is going to leave the physical body. The silver cord that we talked about earlier is now going to be severed. Okay, right? You're now in the 5th dimension. You're going to be accompanied by your higher self. This is the white light that people hear about, or the superconscious mind, as I call that. And then you're going to be taken to, most likely because people die in fear, they're going to go to the lower astral plane first. And that's a nasty dimension. It's going to be like pixies and trolls and gargoyles and all kinds of nasty people are there. And with a little bit of help, you're going to be guided into the white light and go from the lower astral to the upper astral plane. Now, all these dimensions are positive. Your higher self is going to be with you as a guide. Okay, and then it's going to take you through a very series of other dimensions, eventually winding up on the soul plane, which is not considered to be part of the karmic cycle. It's like a DMZ zone. It's not part of the higher planes. It's a plane where you eventually will either ascend from if you're perfect, or you'll go back into the karmic cycle to reincarnate. most people are going to have to go back into the karmic cycle again because they haven't perfected their soul. So with the advice of your higher self and your masters and guides, you're going to be given like holograms and descriptions of not only the life you just lived, but also many of your past lives, but also the future life options. So you have the choice now. It's going to be like choose, door number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and then you choose. You're responsible for your future life choice. Now, you can be blackballed by the family. That's going to be your parents, etc. If they don't like you, you're blackballed and you won't be able to get that. But if they don't, then you eventually will then descend from the soul plane through the various dimensions, including the astral plane, and then eventually into the earth plane as a newborn fetus. And you're actually going to take over your soul is going to inhabit the body, the newborn, while your mother is pregnant, and even before pregnancy, the soul can kind of hang around and then go in and out of the body. So while the fetus is developing, the soul is now getting used to its eventually new home.
I understand. It's interesting you say that newborn babies, up to about 8 weeks, actually the soul leaves that body, and then it becomes a permanent fixture after about 8 weeks. Is that true?
Well, not really. I mean, your 8 weeks is a little bit of a conservative estimate. The soul can leave the body at any time. I mean, people who have near-death experience or brushes in death, the soul leaves the body any time. Okay, you can do it anytime. The difference here is that the soul is going to be more permanently, not permanently, but more fixed with the body. But it leaves any time. It leaves at night. Every night your soul is leaving the body. And you notice how little babies, if you ever raise any kids, how they sleep like 12 hours, 14 hours a day, 15 hours a day.
Yes.
Well, when they're sleeping, they're going through a lot of REMs, and their soul is leaving the body. Because the soul doesn't really like being an infant. It's like helpless, dependent on everybody for everything. It's not really cool. If you're used to having a life where you're like, you're some guy driving around your hot rod picking up chicks, and all of a sudden you're an infant, It's not a good...
You're caged.
Not a good transition. You're not a dude anymore, okay? Or a dudette. So what happens is the soul will kind of like leave the body a lot, and that's why a lot of kids, they look like they're dreary-eyed, or they don't look like they're not stupid. I mean, they don't speak until they're about a year and a half old anyway, but they don't look like they're with it, so to speak. They look like they're kind of like out of it, because the soul leaves the body most of the time in the infant stage. And eventually it settles in, but remember, the soul leaves the body every night, or if you have a very strange experience, your soul will leave. Now, let me give a very significant advice to your listeners. This may not make me very popular, okay, but I have a professional obligation. Folks out there in Radio Land, do not, I repeat, do not use recreational drugs to leave the body. If you do, you're only going to go to one place, and that's the lower astral plane, which from your perception will look like hell. Okay, you never want to use recreational drugs to do out-of-body travel. Never, ever, ever. Okay? And I don't care what some of my colleagues like to say, DMT, and forget it, folks. I've got more than enough experience, more than the rest of the world put together, as far as my colleagues are concerned. You want to do this naturally, use hypnosis, meditation, I don't care what technique you use, but make it natural. You never want to use recreational drugs.
And that makes complete sense, because not only are you constricting yourself by using these drugs to get there, all these extraterrestrials or future time travelers or anybody that are doing this naturally are experiencing a conscious bliss, a bliss consciousness, if you want to call it that.
You want to be natural, you don't want to be artificial. Now, when I was an undergraduate taking my chemical training programs, one of my professors in one of my biology classes, he said to me, my classmates were making fun of me because when I was in college, I never used recreational drug. I was like the only one not using pot or whatever, And he said to me, he goes, I know kids, your buddies are making fun of you, but he said, let me tell you something. If it's natural, the lower animals do it, so don't worry about it. You don't see a lot of squirrels smoking dope, okay? You know what I mean?
That's true. That's true. Go ahead, Johnny.
I was going to say, what stops us from returning, to a soul's heaven while under an OBE or a hypnosis?
Well, you're not going to be okay. So now we're talking about the ascension cycle, which is a very good point, by the way, John. When I was talking about going through the soul plane, now that's the DMZ above the soul plane, where you no longer have any kind of a spiritual body. Okay, now you're going to be pure energy and perfect. Those are called the higher planes. You can't enter into the higher planes until the soul, or what we call the soul plane body, is perfect. But once you do attain perfection, you're going to merge with your higher self. You're going to be at one. That's what atonement means. It means at one with your higher self, which is the white light. Now you're perfect, and now you can either be a Buddha and come back and help people as a spirit guide, which some people do, some entities do, or you can simply rejoin the God energy complex from whence we came by entering into the higher planes. Once you do that, you never come back to the lower planes again. So once you enter the higher planes, it's a one-way ticket, like an express train, or a tube, as you would say in England, to the rejoin the God energy complex, to the various dimensions. And I describe all those in my books. In my Exploring the Fifth Dimension, I go through out-of-body experience, and I give the whole mentality of that. And in my Ascension book, I give the ascension mechanism in detail, too. So if they want to read about it, rather than just trying to talk about it for a few seconds, which I'm sure will lose most of the audience unless they have a background here, but they can read about it in detail.
Johnny's actually got another Facebook question from, I think, Amsterdam. Go ahead and ask it, Johnny. Read it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's from Shibumi in Amsterdam, Holland. She asks, can we get to our Keshik Hall of Records using your OBE or an under hypnosis?
Yes, okay. First of all, being from the Netherlands, I hope that you heard my drug analogy and reference there. Okay? Don't use the drugs. Okay. You're talking about reading the Akashic records. You're talking about reading the Akashic records. And the answer is yes. And there is even an exercise on my homepage. You can see what the technique looks like. It's in my astral voyaging program, which is about out-of-body experiences, and I do have a separate exercise called called Access the Akashic Records. Now, if you use the Fifth Dimensional Travel CD, if you get that when you order my book, yes, you can use that to go into the fifth dimension. Now you can access the Akashic Records. They're technically stored on the causal plane, but you can access it from any dimension. Even on the earth plane, when I do a past life regression or future life progression with a patient, they're accessing their Akashic records. That's where they get the information from. And their higher self is their referee or their librarian to help them with that. That's a very good question, though. But don't use the drugs, Shibumi. No drugs, okay? Put a Ghostbuster sign over the drugs.
So can you tell us, how did you start off in hypnotic regression?
Well, what happened to me, I had a very, would you like to hear about a metaphysical experience that got me from conventional science into this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. I'm going to try to simplify it. It's a very complicated situation, but I'll make it simple. When I was a junior in college, I was on my semester break. This time of the year, it's February, and I was going from Long Island, where I was, where my home was, to New Haven, Connecticut, where I went to college. And it was a winter's day, and I was going back from the semester break, right? So when I was on the road, there was a major snowstorm. It happened to be the largest, most vicious snowstorm in New York City's history in 100 years. And the weather reports were all wrong, okay? My car drifted into the snowdrift, and near the Bronx, I was going through the Bronx River Freeway to get to the New England Freeway. My car just drifted into a snowdrift. I couldn't move it, okay? I was trying to dig it out. My hands were cold. My body was all wet. My jacket, everything was soaking wet. And I'm going to freeze to death. It's like 20 degrees, right? So hypothermia is going to settle in. So I had, what am I going to do? This is like a brush with death, right? So in my head, now I'm not schizophrenic, so people listen to me. If you know me, I'm a very psychologically stable dude. I hear a beautiful woman's voice. It sounds like a Greek siren, and it says, move on a 45-degree angle and walk straight ahead. Now, if anybody's ever been in a snowstorm, you get what's called snow blindness. You can't see anything. Everything is white.
That's right.
It's the proverbial polar bear in the snowstorm, okay? So I can't see anything. All I see is white, right? And it's nighttime, or late afternoon, but the sun's down anyway. And so I'm walking along. I think, what I got to lose? I mean, this voice is sexy, and, what I got to lose? I mean, I'm going to die anyway, right?
Yeah.
So I might as well die happy, okay? So I keep moving, and I walk. I don't know how long I was walking, maybe 20 minutes. And all of a sudden, I see a neon sign, and it says Tardies. Not Sardi's, which is a famous Manhattan restaurant. Tardies, with a T, is actually a catering place in the Bronx. So I see the door. As I get close to it, I think, oh, my God, there's I don't really care if they arrest me. I'm going to break into it. I need to survive, right? I need to have warmth, okay? So I go to the front door, and I put my hand on the front door, and it's unlocked. I figure, oh, my God, I'm not even breaking into the place. So I walk in there. The lights are on. And when I'm in there just a couple of minutes, a woman comes out from one of the back offices, and she goes, young man, why don't you take off your jacket and stuff? I've got a radiator in the other room and dry you out, and I'll fix you something to eat. So literally, my life was saved. But that voice, I never forgot that voice, okay? So I was able to get my car back eventually and blah, blah, blah. Now we focus 3 years later, move forward in time. I'm now a sophomore in dental school in Baltimore, Maryland, and it's, during the summertime, I'm working as a security guard, and I'm working like a double shift. And I was really tired. I was working like 18 hours. So I go back to my little row house, and I just go into the living room in my security outfit on. I have my little uniform on, and I just plop on the couch, and I'm just going to take a nap. It's a Saturday afternoon, and I'm just tired. I'm just burnt out and tired. So as I'm lying down, just for a few moments, I hear the same siren voice that I heard 3 years before that saved my life in the snowstorm, and it said, "Get up and go to the Aquarian Age bookstore downtown." Well, the Aquarian Age bookstore was a new age bookstore in Baltimore, and this was only about 5 miles from my apartment. Okay, so I figured, look, this voice saved my life. Even though I'm tired, I figure I owe it to the universe or to somebody to check this out.
To go,
right?
yeah.
So I go downtown, right? It's only a few-minute drive, right? And I'm at this old bookstore, which is like, I love old architecture. This is like, you could smell the wood, it's built by this, built like in the early 1900s, right? It used to be a speakeasy in the 1920s,
Ah, yes.
So I'm in this bookstore. It's a really cute bookstore, and I don't know what I'm doing there. I got my security guard uniform on, right? I look like a nerd here, right? So I'm standing there. I'm thinking, what am I supposed to do? All of a sudden, this drop-dead gorgeous woman who's about 6.5 feet tall, dressed in a Greek toga, by the way, John, okay? Right? And her hair is up in a bun, blonde hair, green eyes, sparkly green eyes. She comes up to me. I don't know who this woman is. And she says, "I have been waiting for you." So I look at her and I said, "Well, I've been waiting for you all my life. What can I do for you?" So she goes, "Follow me back to the bookshelf." I said, "Okay." So I go back there, and she reaches up. Remember, she's 6.5 feet tall, right? She reaches up, she pulls out a book, and it says, "This book will change your life." Now, at that time, I should tell you, I was a dental student. I was very conventionally trained. I was not against metaphysics, but I didn't care about it because I didn't have any time for that. I was just working my way through school. So the book was called The Search for Bridie Murphy, which was a documented case of reincarnation, a book that was written in the 1950s by a man named Maury Bernstein in Colorado. And he was a businessman. He did hypnosis as like a hobby, and he hypnotized this woman, Virginia Teague, into this very dramatic past life that was documented in Ireland in the 1700s, late 1700s. So I read the book, and of course hypnosis was its modality, and that got me into hypnosis. Okay? Now the story does have a happy ending. Okay? So now my dental career is very part-time. I'm using hypnotherapy full-time, and I retired from dentistry back in 1989 when I moved out to California. So now, in the mid-'90s, when I'm starting to do all my fifth-dimensional techniques, with time travelers and ET abductees and stuff, right? So I'm using my own technique. I use my fifth-dimensional travel technique. I go into the fifth dimension. I'm in this conference room, right? There's my higher self there, representing the self as a human figure rather than a white light. And I see, guess who I see? The woman from the bookstore, right? So I said, telepathically, of course, everything is telepathic. I say, "Yo, Blondie, que pasa?"
Yes.
Who the hell are you? And she says, "I am from the 36th century. I am a time traveler, and I was the one who saved your life because," now this gets really weird. She goes, "Your work is known in the 36th century, so I had to go back in time and save your life because you would have froze to death in the Bronx in 1969 if I didn't." So anyway, that was my orientation to how I went from conventional medicine and dentistry specifically into doing New Age.
Now, let me ask you something about hypnosis. This is actually a really good question. This comes from Ron from Houston, Texas, but this actually applies to me and Johnny, for that matter, when we read it, because we were both laughing at as funny as me.
Right?
Both of us, exactly, yeah. Can you explain why some are susceptible to hypnosis and others are not?
Well, everybody's susceptible to hypnosis. The difference here is this, is that let's separate stage hypnosis from clinical hypnosis. If you go to a stage hypnotist demonstration, that's basically a con artist trying to convince you that he has power over you, so everybody who's a control freak is going to reject that. Okay?
Yes.
And most people can only go into relatively light or light medium levels. Every time you're driving in a car, for example, about a third of the time you're driving in a car, if I hooked you up to an electroencephalograph, you'd measure into an alpha brainwave, which means you're in hypnosis or a daydream state. We call that freeway hypnosis or highway hypnosis, depending on where you live. But if you don't trust or like the person you're working with, especially if it's an entertainment thing, then a person can reject it. I don't have any control over any patient. In fact, I've worked with over 17,000 patients in the last 42 years now, doing over 35,000 regressions and progressions, and I can tell you right now on the air for certainty that I've never hypnotized anyone in my life. What I have done is I've guided them into natural self-hypnosis. They're doing the hypnosis. I'm guiding them. I can't force them into hypnosis. The only time you can do that is with drugs, like if you use a general anesthetic, sodium Brevitol, or it's pentothal. It's called narco-hypnosis because you're using drugs to get them into an alpha level. But I don't do that, okay? And anybody who does is a lousy hypnotist. So basically, if you like and trust a person, people trust me. They like me. They're coming from all over the world. You know, I have my patients, especially my Skype sessions. I see patients from most countries in the world. My books are translated in 20 languages, including Greek, by the way, John.
That's great. Yes.
But to me, when I read that book, it's like it's all Greek to me. So, you know. But anyway, so basically, if you like and trust a person, if they have a reputation that's credible, then you will work with them. If you don't like or trust them, even if they are credible, if you just don't like them for any reason, if you have negative transference, as we call that, you're going to reject it. But everybody goes through hypnosis every day for at least, let me tell you the numbers here. You go through hypnosis for 3 hours a night during the REM cycle, the various REM cycles. You go through the 5-stage sleep cycle at night. During the waking day, you spend another 4 hours, which now is 7 hours out of every 24 hours, which is almost a third of your life, daydreaming, driving in a car, watching TV on the computer, baking cookies, watching baseball games, whatever you're doing there, or football games, England, okay? Every time you focus your concentration where you relax and time goes by quickly and you don't realize moment to moment what's going on, especially the freeway analogy, that's an alpha brainwave level. That's hypnosis. So hypnosis is not unusual. The only reason why we have it, why does Mother Nature or God or whatever you want to call it, why are we given all these hours of hypnosis or alpha brainwaves? It's because it distresses us. If you didn't go through hypnosis every day, you'd actually die of a heart attack or a stroke. It actually is a life preservation, de-stressful mentality. And if you think of a lower animal, for example, think of, let's say, a squirrel. Mm-hmm. Let's say you have a squirrel in your backyard. And let's say there's a big cat, maybe a bobcat or a coyote or something, or some big cat that would feed off that squirrel. If the squirrel sees that predator, it's going to freeze automatically, right? It's going to be motionless.
Like a deer in the headlights, yeah.
Right, deer in the headlights, you got that, right. Or Dan Quayle in the headlights, okay. So the squirrel is going to freeze because now it's going to decide, what do I do? Knowing that the predator is staring at it, it means it's going to be lunch, okay? Well, the squirrel is going to have a little squirrely heart attack and drop dead and become extinct as a species unless it can relax. And what it will do is it will go through an immediate self-hypnotic experience. Yes, all mammals go through hypnosis. And by the way, reptiles do too. They've done work with alligators and crocodiles and lizards and stuff. They all go through hypnosis, okay? They all go through alpha brainwaves. Then it will get its act together, and then it will illustrate the fight or flight mechanism and get the hell out of there and climb up a tree, okay? Or do something to get away from the predator. But it will go through hypnosis. And if you think the world is stressful in your life right now, you take away the alpha brainwave and you won't last a day. So it's given to us, not only is it not dangerous, but it's necessary as a preservation of life.
That actually makes sense. Hold on, Johnny, actually go ahead. I was just going to say that actually makes a lot of sense that you do have your psychological release every time you sleep. And if you don't have that, you could build that agitation. Like, for instance, if you have a day of less than an hour sleep and then, say, another day with no sleep, that third day, I mean, you're just so agitated because it's all built up. So that makes perfect sense. Go ahead, Johnny.
Not only that, but you also have to remember, when you go into the sleep cycle, there is that delta level, which is very, very, like almost brain dead. I mean, you're almost dead. And in that time, you're actually replacing the enzymes and hormones and replacing the millions of cells that you lose every day by friction and other chemicals and stuff. So there is a rationale to going through the sleep cycle, just a physical rest. But I'm talking about an energy aspect, too. I'm talking about energy cleansing, and also which will affect the heart and the physical systems too. So those are examples of why we go through the REM cycle, why it's an out-of-body experience. And when you're out of the body, now you can also have the advantage of the tutorage of your higher self, the perfect part of your soul's energy that will be the Obi-Wan Kenobi to you. See?
Yes.
Dr. Goldberg, can you tell our listeners what's been your most profound hypnotic recession for you? And can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, one of my profound experiences related to a patient who literally saved her life by using techniques. So let me give you an example. Her name, I call her Tammy, and I describe her in several of my books. Tammy was a young college student living in New York City. She graduated from school, it's 1996, okay, so the year is relevant. And she graduates, it's early June, and she calls me up. She had seen my TV movie, CBS did a television movie called The Search for Grace, about a documented case of reincarnation that occurred in Buffalo, New York, in the 1920s, 1927. So she saw that movie, and she did some research on me, and she said that she wanted to learn how to do out-of-body experiences. So she calls me up, and this is before I'm doing Skype sessions now, so she comes from New York to L.A., And she says, can I work with you for like a week? And I said, sure, I do that all the time. I'm working with her. She's a very bright, attractive young woman. And while she's here in town, when you go out of the body, remember, you're going into the fifth dimension, which means you can perceive past the future events. So while she's in town for the 5 days, she goes out of the body, let's say on a Monday night, and she sees something that's going to happen on a Tuesday evening, and sure enough, it does happen exactly as she perceived. Like in one of her visions, she saw herself meeting a guy at a bookstore, the Barnes & Noble bookstore, with a tie-dye T-shirt, and having a rather exotic evening with him, okay? And she described in detail. And then the following evening, she met the guy at the bookstore, and everything happened, okay? So she had about 4 or 5 of these incidences, which means Tammy had a good track record, okay? So now I'm done with her. I said, look, you're all done, okay? Go back to, go on to, I said, so what are your plans? She goes, well, I'm going to go to Paris in July, and then I'm going to spend the last half of summer in Europe with some friends of mine, and then I'm going to go to graduate school. And I said, okay, great, that's cool, I said, keep in touch. So now, 3 weeks later, she calls me at the end of June, and she calls me up, she goes, Doctor, this is Tammy, I have an emergency. And I said, look, Tammy, I retired from dentistry to get away from that, what's going on? And she says, well, I used your CD, right? And I wanted to see what my trip is going to look like. I'm going to Europe, to Paris next month. And I said, okay, so continue. She goes, well, I see myself taking off from JFK, in the jet. The plane goes up, immediately crashes, me and everybody dies. And I said, okay, listen, Tammy, let me help your emergency very quickly. I don't want to run your life. Let me give you a non-hypnotic suggestion. Change your flight plans. Call me in the end of the summer, okay? And she goes, well, gee, yeah, that sounds good. Okay. Now we go, right? Okay. So I don't hear from her, right? So now it's the end of August. And she calls me up again. She goes, Dr. Coker, this is Tammy, and can I talk to you for a minute? And I said, sure. How's your vacation? She goes, well, I want you to know, I did change my flight plans. I was going to go on TWA Flight 800, July 17th, 1996. If you do your homework, that flight took off at JFK. The flight went up in the air, immediately crashed. Everybody, 140 people, or 240 people, including all crew, died. She would have been 241 had she not changed her flight plans.
That was the famous one that was allegedly shot down, possibly.
Well, yeah, they think that it was a conspiracy thing because of they think that's one of the things where it was like a missile got into it, and the government will never give you the reality of it. You're never going to get the proof of that. But there was a conspiracy aspect. They thought it was shot down from either a place in Connecticut or something, or a Navy base or something. They never figured out. But the point is, regardless of what happened there, she was alive. She would have died. Okay, had she not. Now, another one of my most famous cases, of course, is the Search for Grace, which is a case that occurred. I worked with her back in the 80s. She was a woman who came to me when I was in Baltimore at the time, and she was obsessively attracted to a man. She was a single woman, a young, very attractive, very professionally trained single woman, scientifically trained, by the way. And she was dating a married man who was a real jerk, and he was beating her up and very physically abusive. He tried to murder her on 3 different occasions, and I document that in my book, The Search for Grace. And she couldn't break up with him. I mean, this was really obsession, and this was a very serious situation. And so I worked with her, and I took her into past lives. We did like 46 past lives. In 20 of them, the man, and by the way, I call him Johnny, okay? That's not his real name, but that's the name I used in the book. Johnny was the reincarnate of the 20 guys who murdered her in all these lives, and she's dating him now, okay? So if she continued the relationship, this would have been number 21. Well, she was able to break up with him and obviously move on with her life. But the life that the most recent life that she had with him was in 1927 in Buffalo, New York, okay? And her name was Grace Doze, and this was why it's called The Search for Grace. And I got some information to document this case. I turned it over to CBS and their researchers, and they fully documented the case. More interestingly, 2 of the factors that she gave me during her regressions, which of course I turned over to the researcher, she said that I asked her how old she was, and she said she was 32, not looking forward to a 33rd birthday, which is what a woman would say, right? Yes. And then she said the name of her child was Cliff, okay? All right, so I said, okay. Now, when the researcher went into the records, and by the way, you can't get into the New York State records unless you have permission from the governor's office going through the Chamber of Commerce. So you just can't go online and find this out, right? So there's no way the patient could have known this. the two mistakes or errors that were, because the newspapers reported she was 30 years old and the name of her son was Chester, not Cliff. So the network didn't care. They said, look, we got 22 out of 24 facts. We're going to do the case, right? Okay, fine. Well, I, of course, being the scientist that I am, I asked the researcher, I said, look, do me a favor, get the birth and death certificates, okay? It's important to me. So he said, okay. As it turned out, the woman was born on January of 1895. She was 32 years and 4 months, not 30. The newspapers are wrong. And the name of her son was Chester C. Doze. The middle name was Cliff, and everybody called him Cliff. So she was right. The reporters were all wrong, and this was one of the most documented cases. And it was, of course, a case where she was able to rise above the obsession and wasn't murdered by the Johnny type for the 21st time. So I look upon that as one of my most dynamic cases.
We have 3 questions that are waiting. I'm going to go ahead and ask one. Johnny's got to ask the other one, and they're going to be in reverse order, meaning I'm going to ask the most recent one. This one is actually coming from our end, West Coast, but a little further north. This is Frank Balu, I think is the last name. Forgive me, Frank, if I mispronounce it. All the way from Anchorage, Alaska. What proof do you have that the Egyptian Jews were really Egyptians? Or ancient Jews were really Egyptians? That's what it says.
Okay, well, I don't know if you read my Egypt book, because I have a whole chapter on that. Here's the evidence. First of all, it's not just my opinion. If you read scholars, you read what they call Near East Studies guys, like Egyptologists, but they call them Near East Studies guys. If you read the research, they'll give you all the research. But here's a couple of samples. Number one, I'm talking about now an Israeli, not a European Jew, because most of those were converted to Sephardic and all that kind of stuff. I'm not talking about those. That's like anybody can, like Sammy Davis Jr. became Jewish, okay? So, you know what I mean? So
yes.
We're not talking about that, okay? All right. So if you take an Israeli, you take a DNA sample, look at the haploid sample, doing all the genetic research, and then you go to an Egyptian today, and you take a haploid sample or DNA sample of the Egyptian. You know what you're going to have? The same sample, okay? They're going to be identical. Why? Because they come from the same strain. So let me give you some scientific documentation. There's a man by the name, a historian, a 3rd century Heliopolis priest, which would be where Cairo is today, in what we call Lower Egypt in the old days. His name was Manetho. Manetho lived in the 3rd century BC. Okay? He gave us the king's list of all the pharaohs from the first dynasty, which would be the Scorpion King, all the way. Of course, he wouldn't know about Cleopatra because she was after his death. But up until his time, he gave us the king's list, the names of the pharaohs, the approximate dates of their lives, right? Which was corroborated by independent source. So Manetho was one very detailed, obsessive, Virgo-esque, obsessive-compulsive dude, and very accurate. Any Egyptologist or Near East historian will all sing raves about Manetho. Okay, all right. So what does Manetho do? He talks about during the time. Remember, he would not know the name of Akhenaten because Akhenaten was taken away from the records. He was removed from the records. He was the first monotheist. Now, the Jews like to claim they were the first monotheist. Wrong, guys. Not going to happen. In the old days in Egypt, of course, they had 1,000 gods. They worshipped everything. Ra was the main god. Ra Haraki was the sun god.
Yeah, the sun god, right.
But they also had the god of Bath, the cat goddess. They worshipped hippopotamus.
Seth? Yeah, they had everything. Seth, yeah. Right? Yeah.
They were polytheistic. Okay. So what happened was there was a king, a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep III, who had a child by the name of Amenhotep IV. Okay? And he became the pharaoh around the 14th century BC. Well, Amenhotep IV didn't like all these gods. He decided to wipe out all the gods, which of course eventually got him killed. And in the 5th year of his regency, which is the 5th year of his dynasty, he changed his name to Akhenaten, worshipping Aten, which eventually was the sun god. Ra Haraki was the only god. He had a chief priest. His name was Osiriseth. And this is what Manetho reports. Now, Manetho gives us the king's list, okay? So this is a very sharp guy. Osiriseth was named after the king Osiris, okay? So one fine day, and I'm paraphrasing because I wasn't there, Akhenaten would say, "Yo, Osiriseth, bro, come into the conference room. We got a problem here." He says, "You got to change your name. You're named after Osiris, and as far as I'm concerned, Osiris doesn't exist." So what did Manetho report Osiriseth changed his name to? Moses. Now, the reason why that's significant is because Moses, forgetting about the movie The 10 Commandments and forgetting about the Old Testament with all due respect, Moses is not a Hebrew name. It means water bearer. There were a lot of Moseses that were pharaohs. Moses would be a good example. There were many. It simply means water bearer. It's an Egyptian name, not a Hebrew name. Okay? So Moses was an Egyptian. They lived with Akhenaten in the southern part, in what they call the Amarna area, which is about 300 miles south of Cairo, and all that area was destroyed. At least most of it was, and of course Akhenaten was removed from the records. And by the way, his wife was the hot, the most beautiful woman in the world, anyway, so about the late 1890s, they found the Amarna area, and that's where they got Akhenaten. And that's where they found out who he was. So when Manetho was describing him, he didn't know his name. He called him by a different name because he didn't know his name because it was wiped out from the records. But eventually we knew that the man he was referring to was Akhenaten. So basically what happened was the Exodus, not as reported in the Old Testament, the real Exodus was this. The real Exodus was you had a civil war in Egypt. You had the central part of Egypt, let's just say the northern part, Cairo, would be the old Memphis people. Those were the good old boys. They wanted to control Egypt with the polytheistic many gods. Akhenaten was in the south, Amarna, and he, of course, had Moses as his chief priest, who was going to be his successor. And remember, in the Old Testament, Moses had an Ethiopian wife, which was true. So that meant Ethiopia, which is current-day Sudan and Ethiopia combined, was an ally to Akhenaten, and when he was killed, Moses eventually took over as his successor. And so they had a civil war. But to the north of Egypt, in the Sinai Desert, those people were allied with Moses also. So now you have a situation where Cairo, or Memphis area in those days, was surrounded by enemies in the north and enemies in the south. So Moses sent an emissary to the Memphis people, and they said, look, guys, how about you let my people go? This is the deal. You let us go, let us leave Egypt, we'll go into the Sinai Desert, we'll go to what eventually became Israel, which was Canaan.
You're talking about the Exodus story right now, right?
And that's the Exodus. So the Exodus was Egyptians who changed their names to be Jews. You can call yourself anything you want, but basically they were all Egyptians. There were no Jews before the 12th century. In fact, if the evidence is that there's a stela, which is sort of like a manuscript, like a monument, or like a memo written by the Egyptians. It's called the Merkantpar Stela, which is the first reference of the name Israel. And that Merkantpar was one of the sons of Ramses II, which is beyond Akhenaten and Moses by about 100 years, okay? Because, Ramses II had like 90 kids. But Merkantpar was one of his kids that became Pharaoh, and he mentions Israel in his stela for the first time in history. So there were no Jews before the 12th century BC. The patriarchs in the Old Testament, with all due respect, were a nice image in somebody's mind, but they did not exist. Basically, so all the Jews today, if you want, remember, this is blasphemy to a lot of Jews. I understand that, because in the Old Testament, the enemy is Egypt. Well, guess what? The enemy is us. Okay? So that's Manetho giving the historical documentation, which is a scientific reference to your listener's question. That would be the evidence. And by the way, it's not just my opinion. If you go online and read some of the research, you'll see that there are scholars around the world who will give you the support of this. They have different theories about who's who, but they all know that the Old Testament is not a historical document. It's a religious document, okay? There were some very good facts in the Old Testament, but there's a lot of non-facts that were extrapolated and literally made up. And remember, the Old Testament is the source. You know what the source of the Old Testament is? It's the Sumerian tablets. The Noah story and the story of Genesis comes from the Sumerian civilization, which preceded the Jews by over 2,000 years. The Sumerian scripts that we have translated from the original Sumerian, the cuneiforms, they talk about the first civilization known as Iden, E-I-D-E-N. The first man was Adapa, and his wife was Heva. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
There were no copyright laws. The Jews are apparently plagiarized, okay? The Noah story is almost word for word from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian from the cuneiform tablets of Sumeria, which is Sumeria lived from 4000 BC to about 2100 BC, long before the Old Testament was written, if you look at the 13th century or 14th century. And Moses couldn't possibly have written all the 5 books of Moses because the writing style is different. And any scholar will tell you that. Deuteronomy is completely different than the rest of the Old Testament, okay? So It's not even close. But my point is that, so that's my scientific evidence as far as archaeology and just our history.
We
So
got
question number 2.
Go ahead, Johnny, because I was going to say we got 3 more. Go ahead, Johnny. You got 2 of them to ask.
We have a question from Asia, and it's Peter in Cambodia, and it's on the same lines. He asks, within the circles and crafts of hypnotic regression, what is the understanding, opinions, and scientific community's approach to the angels and greys you spoke about this evening?
Well, you understand, most scientists are atheists, so you can forget about angels when it comes to them. They're going to laugh at you. The ones that have an open mind, because there's a law in science this is a law, not a theory. Okay, there's a lot of theories, even Einstein's theory of relativity, but this is a law, which means that it's hard-nosed and it's accepted. It's called Whately's Law of Evidence, which states that if people from all over the world, with no communication with each other, tell you the same thing, it must be true. Every civilization talks about angels. They all talk about floods, by the way. The whole world wasn't underwater, but there were regional floods. We have actually scientific evidence of that in the Middle East, especially the Persian Gulf area, which, of course, would be the origin of the Aiden, the Sumerians, etc. So they all talk about angels. Okay, the different names. The Middle Easterns talk about them, the jinns. They talk about them, and the angels, and the and the Egyptians, the Jews. They all talk about angels. Okay. So basically, what I'm saying is that are there angels? Yes, there are angels, and they're spirit guides. Angels are direct messengers of God. They're very different than a spirit guide. A spirit guide was formerly a human that went through various reincarnations and spiritually is more evolved than us, so therefore it can advise us. But they were eventually human, and they will eventually return to the God energy complex. But an angel, whether it be the seraphims, the hierarchies, or the archangels, they are direct messengers of God. They were never human. They're perfect. They were always perfect and always will be perfect. But they very rarely communicate with us. But yes, I think the scientific community mostly will reject it because they're atheists. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in you die and that's it. You fertilize a lawn and you become part of the nitrogen cycle. That's the way I was trained, but I reject that. So basically, you have to have an open mind. If you have an open mind, Whately's Law of Evidence applies, and you can see that the case for angels and spirit guides is relevant because everybody talks about it.
Now, this is actually a question directly to you from Susan in Lexington, Kentucky. Is Dr. Goldberg himself a time traveler?
Well, my old days with Art Bell, if you go on my website, there was for several years, actually, Art Bell would ask that question, and I was actually playing radio time here. And I would say, I can neither confirm nor deny. And the reason why, I'm going to give you the answer, though. I really wrote an article on this. The reason I said that was because I wanted to kind of like tease the audience a little bit, but I wanted them to do some homework. The reason Art accused me of that, and many of his listeners did, was because of my intimate knowledge of the future technology and the time travel. The answer is no. I was born on the Earth in this century, or last century anyway, in 1948 specifically, and I'm not a time traveler. Yes, I have connections with them. It's sort of like, but it's not Clark Kent versus Superman. I am not a chrononaut, okay? So the answer is no. But I do have intimate knowledge of their history and their technology because they share that with me as well as with my patients. And your listeners out there can also get that information from the horse's mouth by using the various techniques, especially the Time Travelers Training Program CD album.
I'm actually glad. I'm wondering if Susan from Lexington actually asked that because of maybe hearing you, from the old art days. Nonetheless, go ahead, Johnny. You got another one.
Yeah. Do you have a message that you can tell the world that you found from your ongoing studies?
Yes, my message is one of optimism. I'm known when I go on the shows like Coast to Coast, and stuff like that. They call me Dr. Positive. So here's my mentality. Going into the future, with the time travels all the way to the 50th century, forget about all the negativity people face today, the terrorism and the diseases and all the idiots that do things and the politicians. As we go beyond into the 22nd century and beyond, the future is going to be extremely bright. Not just technologically, we're going to have a lot of fun toys, some of which I mentioned, but people are going to be more positive. We're going to have universal democracy throughout the world. You're not going to have fascists and communism and all the other idiot mentality. We're also not going to have theocracies. Religion is not going to be what it is today. It's going to be much more metaphysical, much more reincarnation and spiritually oriented, not dogmatic, if you will. People are going to have free time. They're going to work 15 hours a week. They're going to have plenty of time to do things. They're going to look better. They're going to be taller and thinner and healthier and live longer, 500 to 900 years young as I describe. So I look upon this as you want to be able to, if you want to do this and grow spiritually yourself right now before waiting for the 22nd century and beyond, just access your higher self. Whether you do hypnosis techniques that I profess, whether you do meditation, yoga, with your pranayama, your breathing techniques, which are fine, or any of the shamanic techniques, all these are shamanism, just access your higher self and live in a much more positive spiritual world. I look upon the world as innocent until proven guilty. I'm a very cosmopolitan dude. I have a New York attitude, and I'm very sophisticated. Nobody's ever going to rip me off. But when I meet someone, I never look at upon them as, I never expect negativity. I can judge it and perceive it, but I always expect positivity. And if I see something negative, well, I confront it. But I always assume the positive and think in a very optimistic, I call myself a realistic idealist. Okay? So if you do that and you maintain a more positive approach and access your higher self, the main technique I developed many years ago, almost 40 years ago now, is called the Superconscious Mind Tap, which is there's a separate CD for that, which is a way of training you to access your higher self. If you access your higher self, you are going to be so much better off. It's your best advisor. It's better than any doctor, any religious advisor, any parent, any employer. It's your perfect part of your soul. You can never miss. So my attitude is that keep the faith, keep spiritual, connect with your higher self, do various techniques like out-of-body training, etc., and lose the drugs. Okay? You don't need recreational drugs ever, and you don't need most prescribed drugs, especially antidepressants. Those are all symptomatic. They're going to cause more problems than they're worth. You can use natural energy healing techniques, which are basically shamanic, and you can deal with most issues, including healing, by the way. So that would be my spiritual message for your audience.
Well said. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldberg. Hang by for a minute. I want to thank you, all the audience, for participating in this show and for, of course, requesting Dr. Goldberg. Like I said, of course, Dr. Goldberg, I want to thank you for having such a stimulating conversation to actually make it longer, because the second hour was actually going to be a replay of an older show, so I'm actually glad that we decided to keep you on for the second hour. I also definitely want to thank Johnny Webb, who's almost 5 a.m. London time, and all those around the globe, especially Peter in Cambodia. I have no idea what time zone you're in. Nonetheless, it's been a pleasure. We'll see you again tomorrow night. This is Dr. J and the rest of the Dr. J Radio Live team signing off.